was the last weekend of July 2003, the kind of Tennessee summer that just hung in the air, thick with cicadas, heavy with the smell of pine. 4 cousins had been planning this trip for months. They'd grown up together just a few miles apart, fishing the same creeks every summer since they could hold a rod. Now, this wasn't just any camping trip. This was their send-off, a last weekend together before life started pulling each of them in different directions. Josh was the oldest, 19 years old. He'd just bought himself a used SUV with money from his summer job, and come fall, he was headed up to college in Knoxville. His little brother Ryan was 17, the quiet one, kind of kid who'd rather have his nose in a book than out raising hell with the rest of them. Their cousins Amy and Caleb rounded out the group. Amy was 15. Caleb was 18. The 4 of them, tight as family gets in those parts. The plan was simple enough. 2 nights camping out near the ridge, same spot where their grandpa used to hunt back in the day. Nothing fancy. Nothing dangerous. That Friday afternoon, a clerk over at the marathon station en route, 19 remembered them stopping in. Security footage would later confirm it. 5:46 in the evening. They bought firewood, bottled water, a disposable Kodak camera. Gas was running about $1.60 a gallon that summer, and Josh paid in cash like his daddy taught him. On the tape, they looked relaxed, laughing, teasing each other about who forgot the matches. There was nothing, and I mean nothing, out of place about any of it. Nothing that would suggest it'd be the last time anybody ever saw them alive. By Saturday evening, rain rolled in over the hills. The forecast had called for clear skies, but locals remembered how fast the temperature dropped that night. Fog settled thick along the low roads. A farmer driving home that night told police later he'd heard something strange echoing off the ridge. Metallic, like a chain dragging across rocks, or a piece of sheet metal banging in the wind. He thought it was odd, but not odd enough to stop and check. When the cousins didn't come back Sunday evening, the family started making calls. By dawn Monday, that worry had turned into something sharper, real fear. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. The only message anyone got came from Ryan's phone. Half a second of static. Then the line cut. By midday, both families drove out to the trailhead off County Road 214. That's where they found Josh's SUV parked just past the gravel turnoff. Keys still in the ignition. Doors locked. Deputies from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office got there within the hour, and right away, something felt off. Inside the vehicle, no signs of a struggle. The back seats were folded down. Sleeping bags, a cooler, a first aid kit, all tucked in neat against the side. But here's the thing. There were no fingerprints, none on the door handles, none on the dash, none on the wheel, nothing except Josh's. The driver, it looked like somebody had wiped the whole thing down. Even the smudges on the inside glass were gone, cleared away, leaving these faint streaky shines. Searchers followed tire tracks and footprints out to a small clearing about half a mile from the car, and what they found there, well, it didn't add up either. The campsite looked half-finished, like the kids had just gotten there, or maybe like they were packing up to leave. The tent was unrolled, but never staked down. Cans of food sat unopened in a plastic bag. The fire ring, damp wood, not even partially burned. And on a flat rock nearby a flip phone, screen still glowing weak, a low hiss of static coming through the speaker. The whole scene looked staged, like somebody had set it up but never actually lived in it. Deputies cordoned off the site and ran their first sweep. The ground was soaked from the rain the night before, but the search dogs couldn't pick up a trail past 200 yards. The scent just stopped, like the whole group had walked into the fog and disappeared. The first theory was the hopeful one. They'd gotten lost. The terrain around Red Hollow was rough. Steep drops, hidden ravines, brush so thick, even seasoned hikers got turned around. Search teams fanned out, flagging tape going up, folks shouting names into the gray. Helicopters circling overhead, spotlights cutting through the haze. But nothing moved below. By that evening, more than 30 volunteers had joined in, including relatives. Amy's daddy walked the creek bed until dark, calling her name until his voice gave out. At the edge of the ridge, deputies found something small, but chilling. A folded piece of notebook paper soaked through, pressed deep into the mud. Only 2 words were still legible. South Path, that was it. No way to tell who wrote it. No way to tell when. The rain had washed away any prints. Investigators bagged it, sent it off for testing. But the truth is, that note never gave up its secrets. Weather reports showed a cold front had pushed through Saturday night. Temperatures dropped into the low 40s, way too cold for late July in Tennessee. That might have explained the fog, but it didn't explain how 4 young people with gear and flashlights could vanish without leaving so much as a shoe print past their camp. The next day, deputies pushed the search radius out to 2 miles. They found a section of barbed wire fencing that had collapsed, leading toward an overgrown trail. Wasn't on any of the park maps. According to county records, it used to lead toward an old logging operation abandoned back in the 80s. Same direction the note pointed. Searchers followed it as far as they could, but the trail just ended. Washed out gully, slick red mud, broken branches, nothing more. Word spread fast. Volunteers started showing up from neighboring towns. The sheriff's office set up a command post at the trailhead. Over the next 48 hours, they covered 10 square miles. Drones, cadaver dogs, state search and rescue, the whole 9 yards, and they came up with nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a food wrapper, not a dropped flashlight. Reporters started calling it the Red Hollow Mystery. Local news ran footage of the family standing near the SUV, faces drawn, voices trembling, begging for help. At one point, a journalist asked the sheriff if foul play was suspected. He paused before answering. "We're keeping all options open," he said. But the truth was, investigators had already started feeling like something was wrong. Late that week, a crime scene tech re-examined the SUV under blacklight and found something, faint streaks along the inside of the rear door, the kind you get from latex gloves. Whoever had been in that vehicle took care not to leave a single trace. That detail changed everything. The case shifted toward possible abduction or staged disappearance. But how? No signs of struggle, no tire tracks from another vehicle. The area was isolated, miles from the nearest house. For somebody to intercept that group unnoticed, well, it would have taken precision or a hell of a lot of luck. As the sun set over Red Hollow that 6th night, fog rolled back in, thicker than before. Searchers said they heard those metallic noises, again, soft, rhythmic, almost like tapping. Some of them brushed it off as wind. Others refused to go back the next morning. When the sheriff reviewed the findings later, that week, he told a reporter quietly, "It's like the woods just swallowed them whole." And for the families standing by that empty trailhead, staring into the darkening ridge, that's exactly how it felt. By the second day, Red Hollow looked less like a missing persons case and more like a military operation. Cruisers lined the gravel road. Volunteers poured in from 3 counties. Sheriff Carl Donnelly was running point, older guy, born and raised in Monroe County. He'd handled missing hikers before, but never 4 at once, and never without a single trace. By morning 2, he called in state resources, helicopters with thermal imaging, more cadaver dogs, park rangers who knew the terrain. The grid went out 3 miles in every direction. They expected to find footprints, maybe an abandoned campsite, something simple. But the forest gave them nothing. Volunteers said it was like the woods had been reset overnight. Not a snapped branch, not a torn piece of fabric. Even the dogs were confused, each one losing the scent at exactly 200 yards. Same spot every time. By day 4, the mood shifted. What started as adrenaline and determination had turned into something quieter, more desperate. The weather wasn't helping either. Mist clung to the trees through the mornings. By afternoon, the heat came back, heavy, suffocating. Boots sank into red mud that seemed to pull at every step. Searchers started calling it the Hollow's Pull, a half joke, but after a while, none of them found it funny anymore. Around this time, detectives started cataloging everything from the SUV. And in the glove box, an officer found something interesting, a folded MEP, a photocopy of an old logging survey from the early 80s. Faded pen. Mark circled an area southeast of where the cousins had parked, and right in the middle, a red X, drawn over a spot labeled Gully 3B. When investigators compared it to topographic maps, the marked area lined up with a ravine several miles off the public trails. Sheriff Donnelly sent 2 deputies to check it out. The trek took nearly 2 hours through thick brush and steep elevation. When they got to the coordinates, there was nothing, just rusted out logging equipment, chains, a collapsed structure that might have been a tool shed decades back. The ground was uneven, pocked with shallow holes. Animal burrows? Near one of them, they found bones, later confirmed to be from a deer, long since picked clean. But what unsettled the searchers most was the quiet. No insects, no birds, just the low creak of trees swaying overhead. The deputies radioed back. Nothing there, nothing human at least. Still, they flagged the site, logged it, and for days afterwards, search teams kept coming back to it, almost like they were drawn there, each time empty-handed. By midweek, frustration started boiling over. Rumors spread among the volunteers that police had mishandled early evidence, that the SUV had been unlocked before forensics arrived. The sheriff denied it, but the damage was already done. Family members started clashing with officers, demanding more manpower, more helicopters, more dogs. A local pastor tried to mediate, but tempers flared. Caleb's uncle shouted at the sheriff that the department had wasted time. The argument nearly turned physical before deputies stepped in. It was grief, pure and raw, spilling out into the only space left to hold it. When the media picked up the story, reporters swarmed the small town. Satellite trucks parked outside the sheriff's office. Interviews ran on local TV. The same images over and over, the cousins' smiling faces and yearbook photos. The trailhead roped off with police tape. The sheriff in front of microphones repeating the same promise. We're doing everything we can. For a few days, the case became a regional obsession. Talk radio hosts went wild with theories. Some said the kids stumbled onto something illegal, drug operation, maybe poachers. Others blamed wildlife, pointed to the area's history of black bears. One morning show even brought on a self-described local historian. He talked about the Red Hollow sinkholes, sections of ground that had collapsed years back. The county had fenced them off after some livestock went missing. That rumor took on a life of its own. Searchers started calling one particular depression near the ridge the pit. It had been sealed with chain link decades earlier, but several locals said the fencing had rusted away. The theory spread that the cousins might have wandered too close, fallen in. County engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar, but the readings came back inconclusive. Sinkhole was too deep, the soil too unstable. On day 7, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a dry creek bed about a mile from the campsite. Hope surged again. The area got cordoned off, excavated for 2 days. What they found was a shallow depression filled with rainwater, animal tracks, nothing else. It was the first of many false alarms. As the days wore on, even the most determined volunteers started to fade. People had to get back to work, back to their families. The search perimeter expanded past 15 square miles. Forest, pasture, stretches of the old county road. Each new area gave them nothing but more silence. One night, going over maps by lantern light, Josh's uncle remembered something, a conversation he'd had with his nephew just days before the trip. Josh had mentioned camping near where Grandpa used to hunt, somewhere off the ridge, past the old fire road. That clue sent a fresh wave of searches toward the western slopes. But again, no sign of the cousins emerged. By day 10, the official search got scaled back. Only a handful of officers stayed on rotation. Families protested outside the courthouse, begged the sheriff not to give up. But the truth was they'd run out of leads. Every logical explanation had been tested. Every trail walked, every piece of ground checked, and nothing added up. The press lost interest. The crews packed up. The headlines got smaller. The story slipped from the front page. For the families, that silence was unbearable. They kept searching on their own, forming small groups on weekends, walking the same trails over and over, convinced they must have missed something. In the months that followed, Red Hollow went back to being what it had always been, an expanse of forest that swallowed sound and memory alike. The signs from the search came down slowly, but folks who'd been there said it never felt the same again. Hunters spoke of unease in that part of the ridge, animals acting strangely quiet, sudden drops in temperature near the gully marked on that old map. For the sheriff, it became the case that haunted his career. For the families, it was a wound that just wouldn't close. By the time the first anniversary came and went, all that was left were questions and a feeling that something in those woods knew exactly what happened and wasn't ready to give it up. By 2025, Red Hollow had become a story you only heard in fragments, the kind told quietly at campfires or on late night radio when the weather turned cold. To locals, it was part of the county's folklore now. The case of the four cousins had faded from the headlines years back, but it never really disappeared. It lingered, the same way fog still clung to those hills every morning. Hanging low, refusing to lift, the road into the hollow was cracked now, half swallowed by overgrowth. The old wooden sign at the trailhead leaned crooked, paint-flaked, letters barely there. Only a handful of people still went out, hunters, hikers, the occasional curiosity seeker who'd grown up hearing the story as a warning. Parents still told their kids not to wander past the second ridge. Stories about phones losing signal, radios cutting to static, animals refusing to enter certain parts of the forest. None of it ever proven, but everybody seemed to agree on one thing. The woods around Red Hollow felt wrong. Sheriff Carl Donnelly had retired nearly a decade earlier, but the case never really left him. Every July, on the weekend closest to the anniversary, he came back. He'd park his truck near the old trailhead, stand by the weathered memorial cross somebody had hammered into the ground, and stay there till sundown. The new sheriff once asked him why he still went. Donnelly only said, because somebody has to. His hair had gone gray, his posture slower. But even in his 70s, he carried that same quiet guilt, the kind that never lets you forget what wasn't found. Two of the parents had passed by then, Amy's mother in 2016 after a long illness, Josh and Ryan's father 2 years later from a heart attack. Both went to their graves without answers. Around the 20-year mark, the story resurfaced. A true crime podcast called Vanished in Plain Air released a 3-part episode about the Red Hollow disappearance. The hosts dissected every known detail. The static-filled phone, the wiped fingerprints. The note that said South Path, they interviewed retired deputies, local hunters, even Donnelly himself. Within weeks, the episodes went viral. YouTube creators started posting deep dives. Forums lit up with speculation. Online sleuths started connecting dots that hadn't been public knowledge. Some pointed out a pattern of missing person reports going back to the 80s. Hikers, hunters, even a utility worker, all within a 10-mile radius of the ridge. With most cold cases revived by the internet, speculation spread faster than facts. But that surge of attention did something nobody expected. It reached the right ears. In early 2024, a detective from the Monroe County Cold Case Unit named Laura Hensley quietly reopened the file. She was young, too young to remember the original disappearance. But she'd grown up hearing the story. In an interview later, she said she always thought it sounded unfinished. The evidence boxes were still in the basement of the sheriff's office, weathered folders, VHS tapes from old news broadcasts, original case, photos sealed in plastic. A lot of it had degraded with time, moisture, mold, faded ink. But Hensley believed new technology could do what the old technology couldn't. She reached out to the families that spring, asked for updated DNA samples to compare against unidentified remains across the state. It wasn't a promise, just a chance, a way to rule things out. The families agreed. After 22 years, even the smallest action felt like progress. Meanwhile, Something else was stirring in Red Hollow. The county had approved a new logging project that would reopen parts of the forest untouched since the early 2000s. Environmental groups protested. But the contract moved forward anyway. Bulldozers and survey crews started marking trees, cutting access roads near the lower ridge, not far from where the cousins' camp had been found. Locals didn't like it. They said the hollow should be left alone. Some of the older residents claimed they'd seen things there. Lights flickering between the trees at night sounds like metal grinding deep underground. Hunters said their GPS units would malfunction near the Gully. The county dismissed it all as superstition. But when the logging began, the old story started breathing again. Workers reported equipment failures, radios losing power mid-transmission. One foreman told a local paper his men refused to work past sunset. Easy to dismiss as nerves. But the timing couldn't have been more coincidental. The same week the machines moved in, Detective Hensley got her first real tip. A man came forward, said he'd been a volunteer during the original 2003 search, said he'd remembered something that never made it into the reports, a conversation between two deputies on the last night of the search. They'd been standing near the ridge when their radios cut out, replaced by that same faint static everybody remembered from the phone. One of those deputies, long retired now, had sworn he heard a voice beneath the noise. A single word, repeated over and over. The witness couldn't remember what it was, but he said it didn't sound right. Hensley logged the statement, said nothing publicly. But privately, she wondered if it tied back to the strange interference patterns mentioned online. The only way to know was to go back to where it all began. That summer, she drove out to Red Hollow herself, stood at the overgrown trailhead with the old case file in her hands. The road was nearly impassable now, but the forest still looked the same. Dense, silent, waiting. For the first time in years, Red Hollow wasn't just a ghost story anymore. It was an open question. And what nobody knew yet was the truth that had slept under those woods for 22 years was about to surface. Look, every case we cover takes weeks of research, long nights digging through real records to bring forgotten stories back to light. We do this because these lives mattered. They deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, hit subscribe. Drop us a comment telling us which part of this case hit you the hardest. Now, let's get back to it. It was early September when Mark Ellison parked his truck at the edge of the old service road leading into Red Hollow. He'd hunted these woods most of his life, knew their temperament, the way fog settled like a low ceiling, how every step off trail felt like walking into a different world. It was bow season, air cool and still. He'd planned to set up along the ridge, but as he moved deeper into the trees, something caught his eye. An area where the ground didn't look quite right. He noticed it first because of the stones. The forest floor was mostly leaf litter and roots, but here a shallow patch of earth was covered in small rocks, arranged unnaturally flat, like somebody had tried to disguise something. Mark hesitated. He'd stumbled onto plenty of old logging debris before, rusted tools, animal carcasses. But this looked different. The soil was compacted, the stones placed deliberately. He crouched down, pushed a few aside with his glove, and underneath, something dull caught the light. It wasn't metal exactly, more like hardened rubber. When he brushed away more dirt, he saw the edge of what looked like a boot sole, cracked, half buried, still attached to a sliver of decayed fabric, just inches away something else, small, gray-white. At first he thought it was a deer bone, but then he saw the shape, the curvature, the texture, human. Mark stood frozen. His first instinct was disbelief. The second was dread. He pulled his phone from his jacket, stared at it for a moment, then dialed 911. When dispatch picked up, his voice shook. "I think I found something up on Red Hollow Ridge." Within an hour, deputies arrived. The area got sealed off. Mark was asked to stay nearby while investigators worked. He gave them his GPS coordinates, walked through his route, explained how he'd gone off trail to avoid spooking game. By late afternoon, the ridge was crawling with investigators in protective suits, moving slow, deliberate. Photos taken from every angle, markers placed beside each object. Then, the first layer of stones came away, and underneath a shallow depression, roughly 5 feet long, 2 feet wide, too small to be a grave, but deep enough to suggest something had been buried there on purpose. As the dirt came up, they found more fragments. Small bones in irregular clusters, sections of weathered cloth clinging to them like ash. A rusted metal flask lay beside the remains. The initials JR faintly etched on its side. One of the detectives caught it right away. Those initials matched one of the missing cousins, Joshua Rayburn. The whole atmosphere shifted in an instant. For 22 years, Red Hollow had existed in a strange limbo, half myth, half memory. But now, under the quiet canopy of trees there, was no mistaking what they'd found. The excavation stretched into the next day. Forensics brought in portable lighting, tents to shield the site from weather. The process was slow. Every inch of soil sifted and cataloged. Beneath the first cluster of remains, they found more fragments of a second skull, partial ribs, a piece of melted plastic. It wasn't until the coroner examined it all that the first real detail emerged. The bones showed clear signs of blunt force trauma, fractures consistent with a hard impact, possibly from a fall, possibly from a strike. No animal marks, no drag evidence, no post-mortem disturbance from wildlife. Whatever had happened up there, it had been violent and it had been human. Within 72 hours, dental records confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to Josh Rayburn and his cousin Caleb Thomas, 2 of the 4 who'd vanished back in 2003. The announcement hit the local community like a shockwave. For the family's relief and heartbreak at the same time, after 2 decades of not knowing, at least part of the mystery had finally surfaced. Detective Hensley showed up on site personally, walked the perimeter, slow, taking in the geography. The location was nearly 2 miles from where the original search teams had focused, outside the grid, hidden by dense undergrowth and steep, uneven slopes. Easy to miss even with aerial scans, which raised an immediate question. Had the cousins ever made camp here? Or had somebody brought them afterward? Forensics added more clues fast. In the surrounding soil, techs found nylon fibers, a corroded lighter, pieces of melted plastic later identified as parts of a portable stove, a 2003 Coleman model, the same type sold in outdoor stores that summer. The flask went to the lab first. Despite 2 decades of exposure, trace material was still inside. Residual alcohol mixed with soil sediment. The metal had been dented on one side, folded inward like it had been struck. Detective Hensley noted something else that bothered her. The depression wasn't a typical grave. It lacked the depth and uniformity of a burial done with care or with time. The layering of stones suggested somebody in a hurry, trying to conceal rather than preserve, like they needed to hide the evidence quickly and then leave. Mark Ellison's GPS data turned out to be invaluable. By cross-referencing his route with old forestry maps, analysts noticed a pattern. The site he stumbled on it lined up almost perfectly with the coordinates of that old Gully 3B location, the same spot marked on the 2003 map found in the cousin's SUV. When ground-penetrating radar came in, it revealed more anomalies, extending several yards beyond the initial dig zone. Shallow voids in the soil, irregular density shifts, consistent with buried metal or bone, so they kept digging. Techs uncovered a half-buried camping stove frame, rusted but intact, a section of weathered tarp fused to the earth. Underneath that, small bones, possibly animal at first glance, later identified as human phalanges. Another layer down revealed 2 more items, a metal keychain shaped like a compass, and the broken faceplate of a wristwatch, frozen at 10:47. The forensic team worked the ridge for a week. Each night, the sound of digging gave way to the drone of generators, the distant hum of the forest. Even the seasoned investigators admitted it. The atmosphere up there was oppressive. Some described a sense of being watched. Whether it was nerves or something deeper, none of them could say. When the county coroner's office released its preliminary findings, the details were stark. Both victims had suffered blunt force trauma before death, fractures suggesting a single directional strike. The injuries weren't consistent with a fall or a collapse. The melted plastic indicated a fire, possibly accidental, possibly deliberate, near or over the burial site. Charred debris in the surrounding soil showed chemical traces from burned nylon, consistent with tent fabric. The discovery turned Red Hollow from a cold case into an active investigation. Overnight, law enforcement returned to the ridge with new urgency. Mapping where radar had shown more anomalies, drone footage caught subtle shifts in the ground. Shallow depressions scattered like scars across the slope. Analysts flagged 2 specific zones for deeper analysis, both within 20 yards of where the first remains had been found. Excavation resumed quietly in the weeks that followed. The site expanded another 30 yards downslope, where the radar had picked up more voids. What started as a forensic dig started looking like archaeology. Every scoop of soil sifted, every find photographed. The deeper they went, the stranger it got. By the end of the second week, they uncovered the top of what looked like a metal frame. At first, they assumed it was more logging equipment, another rusted relic from the 80s, swallowed by time. But as the shape took form, it became clear. It wasn't machinery. It was a vehicle, buried nose first into the hillside, rear axle jutting out of the dirt. Metal corroded, paint long gone, but faint lettering was still visible on one of the doors. Monroe County Maintenance. County records showed one of those trucks, a 1978 Chevrolet utility model, had been reported missing in 1989. After a storm-damaged part of the ridge, the assumption back then was that it slid into a ravine, got washed away. Nobody had ever found it. Until now, investigators brought in a crane to stabilize the slope, carefully removed the soil around the cab. The windows were shattered. Interior smelled of rust and burned plastic. Inside, wedged between collapsed seats and a layer of compacted mud, they found 3 objects that stopped everyone cold. 3 cell phones melted together into a single black mass. And beside them, the remains of a smashed handheld radio. Now, this didn't make sense. Cell phones from 2003 shouldn't have been inside a truck that vanished more than a decade earlier. But when techs cleaned and scanned the fused pieces, faint serial numbers came up under the residue, and those numbers matched. 3 of the phones registered to the missing cousins, Amy's flip phone, Ryan's Nokia, Caleb's prepaid model, all 3 listed as untraceable since the weekend they vanished. The handheld radio, though nearly destroyed, still bore a partial tag, property of Monroe County, meaning it had belonged to the same maintenance department that once operated the truck. But why it was there and how those phones ended up inside that was the question. The coroner's team kept analyzing the remains recovered earlier. Both Josh and Caleb showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with impact from falling debris or heavy metal. More alarming bone marrow samples from both contained carbon monoxide residue, levels high enough to indicate they'd been breathing the gas before death. That finding shifted the entire investigation. It suggested the cousins hadn't died immediately from violence or exposure. They died from suffocation, likely trapped in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. Detective Hensley started piecing the timeline together. It was early August 2003 when they vanished, a weekend marked by fast-moving storms and lightning strikes across the county. If the cousins had taken shelter from the rain, maybe they'd found this old truck, half buried near the slope. The vehicle could have offered temporary refuge, interior shielded from the weather. But if the exhaust was damaged or blocked by soil, running the engine could have filled the cab with carbon monoxide in minutes. On paper, that seemed plausible. An accident, a tragic chain of events. But the deeper they dug, the less it felt like one. When forensics examined the soil around the truck, they found something. The earth had been disturbed years after the original burial. Layer compression tests showed multiple shifts. The first from natural erosion, The second from manual disturbance, likely within 2 to 3 years of the cousin's disappearance. That detail alone contradicted the idea that the remains had simply been sealed away since 2003. Somebody had come back. The team also recovered a piece of fabric wedged under the driver's seat, a torn section of what looked like a uniform sleeve. The tag, still legible beneath the grime, bore the Monroe County seal. DNA analysis later confirmed it belonged to a male adult, but not one of the victims. When records got checked against county employees from the early 2000s, no match came up. The department had no record of anyone assigned to that sector at the time. As the days passed, the investigation took on a different tone. What had started as relief, the long-awaited discovery of answers, turned into something claustrophobic. The site itself seemed to close in around them. Every piece of evidence pointed to overlapping timelines: a storm, an abandoned maintenance vehicle, an apparent accident. Yet, the evidence of interference was undeniable. Investigators found fragments of plastic insulation scattered around the buried chassis, partially melted, distinct. Chemical analysis showed traces of ethanol and lubricant residue, suggesting a fire had burned there at some point, though not strong enough to reach the surface. The scorched soil matched the chemical composition of camping fuel, the same type used in that Coleman stove they'd found earlier. Forensics started reconstructing a possible sequence. The cousins might have taken shelter near the slope during the storm, lit their stove for heat, not realizing how close they were to a buried truck or to an enclosed air pocket. The fire would have burned through oxygen fast, released carbon monoxide that pooled inside the depression. The gas would have overcome them in minutes. But that still didn't explain the blunt force injuries or why the remains had been moved. Hensley suspected a second collapse. The old truck, already unstable in the hillside, might have shifted after heavy rainfall days later, crushing part of the camp. In the chaos, the equipment phones, radio, lighter could have tumbled into the cabin. Erosion and soil movement could have buried everything where it now rested. It was an elegant theory, but it didn't hold up because one of the skulls recovered from the site had sediment embedded not just outside, but inside the cranial cavity, meaning it had been exposed, then reburied later. That kind of post-mortem relocation doesn't happen naturally. Somebody had dug into the site, disturbed the remains years after the deaths. County records showed that in 2005, a contractor had been hired for limited erosion control in the same area, though no maintenance vehicles were logged at the location. The name on the work order was illegible, document water damaged, incomplete. Investigators started wondering whether somebody connected to that project had stumbled across the remains and instead of reporting it, decided to hide what they'd found. When the evidence went to the state lab, analysts caught something else. The 3 phones from the truck all showed heat damage. But one, the Nokia, registered to Ryan, still had intact memory sectors. Using data recovery software, they pulled partial files, corrupted timestamps, incomplete logs, and one brief audio fragment. The recording lasted 6 seconds, mostly static, but just before it ended a faint sound, heavy breathing, followed by what might have been a word. Beneath the noise, some thought it sounded like help, others stop. The signal was too degraded to be sure. When the results were shared with the families, it tore everything open again. The grief that had settled into quiet endurance torn apart all over. For years, they'd imagined their kids lost in the woods, maybe unaware of what was coming. Now, the evidence suggested they'd lived long enough to be trapped, suffocating, maybe calling out, in vain. Detective Hensley went back to the ridge that evening. Long after the crews had gone, the site had been covered for safety, but the ground still bore the dark impression of where the truck had been pulled from. The earth. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of damp clay. She crouched near the edge, ran her hand over the soil, thinking about the layout, the tent, the stove, the slope, the vehicle. Everything about it felt wrong. If the cousins had really sought shelter, they would have been near the main trail, not 2 miles down slope, in a restricted maintenance zone. And if they'd stumbled onto that old truck, how would they known it was there, buried under the dirt? It wasn't visible from any approach, not even from the ridge above. The next morning, she ordered a complete re-examination of Mark Ellison's GPS data. When analysts mapped his coordinates against the excavation grid, something strange showed up. The hunter's route lined up almost perfectly with the faint outline of an old access road, one that didn't exist on modern maps. That road had led directly to the maintenance zone. Last serviced in 1989, the same year the truck disappeared. The implication was chilling. The cousins might have followed the remnants of that road, unknowingly, led there by curiosity, or confusion during the storm, or somebody who knew the terrain had led them. Whatever the truth was, one fact stayed solid. The four cousins hadn't just vanished into the woods. They'd walked straight into a place already buried by time. And for reasons nobody could explain, somebody, years later, had gone back to make sure their story stayed buried too. It took months before the full picture took shape. By early spring of 2026, the State Forensic Lab had finished cross-referencing every piece of data recovered from Red Hollow. DNA sequencing confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remaining traces near the buried truck belonged to Amy and Ryan, the two cousins whose remains had never been located. Until now, for the first time in 23 years, all four names could finally be laid to rest. But even with that confirmation, the question that haunted everyone wasn't just who, it was how. How had four young people familiar with the outdoors, equipped with supplies, vanished less than 5 miles from a main road and gone undiscovered for 2 decades? The answer, when it came, was equal parts tragic and unsettling. Forensic reconstruction painted a story that began with curiosity and ended in confusion. Investigators determined that the slope where the cousins had camped sat directly above an old, empty underground structure. Not a mine, exactly, but part of a long decommissioned storm drainage system. Built back in the 70s for the county's road department, the truck they'd uncovered had been one of several vehicles used during that project. Over the years, heavy rain and erosion had collapsed sections of the ground, leaving hollow voids beneath the ridge. According to soil analysis and 3D mapping, a small entrance to that underground chamber would have been visible 2003. A narrow opening between exposed rock and tree roots, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It had since been sealed by sediment and time, but in photos recovered from one of the cousins' old disposable cameras, investigators noticed something chilling. One of the last frames, grainy, blurred, showed what looked like a dark tunnel, framed by beams of rusted metal, a structure nobody had known existed before the excavation. Forensic engineers theorized that the group had discovered this opening while exploring the ridge, decided to check it out. Evidence suggested they'd brought their stove inside for light and warmth. Traces of camping fuel were found throughout the chamber, along with scorched rock consistent with a small controlled flame. But something went wrong almost immediately. The coroner's report confirmed all four cousins had significant carbon monoxide levels in their bone marrow, indicating exposure to toxic gas before death. Further analysis of the surrounding rock revealed a corroded metal pipe, part of the original storm drain's ventilation system, collapsed under decades of pressure. That pipe had once connected to the buried maintenance truck's exhaust system. When investigators reconstructed the alignment, they realized something. If the truck's engine had been restarted during a later maintenance attempt, even briefly, it could have vented exhaust directly into the underground chamber. The timeline was horrific, but plausible. The cousins, trapped inside a narrow enclosure, would have been overcome in minutes. The stove, the fuel residue, the heat damage to the phones, all of it matched the conditions of a confined space gas leak. The partial collapse of the tunnel afterward likely buried them where they fell, sealing the site from view. For most of the team, that conclusion was enough. It explained the evidence, provided closure. But there was one detail that wouldn't fit, a detail that made even seasoned investigators uneasy. During the final phase of excavation just beyond the collapse zone, forensic surveyors uncovered a trail of boot prints pressed into the clay, faint but distinct, preserved by the oxygen-poor soil. The tracks led away from the collapse, followed a shallow incline, then vanished at the edge of the slope. Analysis confirmed they didn't match any of the victim's footwear. The tread pattern was older, possibly from a work boot manufactured in the 90s. Whoever left those prints had been there after the tunnel collapsed. That single anomaly changed the story. Again, if those prints belonged to a rescuer, nobody had ever come forward. If they belonged to somebody who'd stumbled across the site, perhaps during the 2005 erosion repairs, it meant that person had chosen not to report what they saw. Forensic soil dating gave that theory weight. The topmost layer of disturbed earth surrounding the burial measured roughly 20 years old, matching a reburial period around 2005. 2 years after the cousins disappeared, somebody had uncovered part of the site and deliberately filled it back in. Hensley combed through county employment records from that year, looking for anyone who'd worked near the ridge. The maintenance logs were incomplete, but one name surfaced over and over. A seasonal contractor, Roy Dalton. He'd been a drifter, hired for a few months during flood repairs, then vanished himself later that summer. His last known address was a trailer park 30 miles south of Red Hollow. He'd left behind unpaid rent, a truck sold for cash, no forwarding information. Locals remembered him vaguely, quiet, odd, the kind of guy who kept to himself. One shop owner remembered Dalton coming in once with deep scratches running down his arms, dirt caked under his nails, saying something about a bad cave-in. A police report filed years later listed Dalton as a missing person, but no remains were ever found. Whether he'd stumbled onto the site by accident or had some prior connection to it, no one could prove. But for the sheriff's office, his disappearance, combined with the reburial dating, was enough to close the loop. Somebody had found the cousins, realized what they'd uncovered, and instead of reporting it, buried the evidence all over again. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of fear, maybe both. When the news broke publicly, it brought relief and disbelief in equal measure. For some, it was the closure they'd waited 2 decades for. For others, it was just another layer of unanswered questions. The families gathered on the ridge that spring to dedicate a memorial. 4 wooden crosses, standing in a line overlooking the forest. Each bore a name, carved by hand, letters simple but deliberate. There were no speeches, just silence. The kind that fills a place when grief finally stops being an open wound and becomes something quieter, heavier, permanent. Detective Hensley stood with him, watched as the wind moved through the trees, stirring the dry leaves that had already begun to settle. Nearby, the old excavation site had been filled and sealed, a faint patch of disturbed earth, now overgrown with grass. For all intents and purposes, Red Hollow was finished. But even she couldn't shake what was left behind. Those boot prints leading away from the collapse, preserved like a final unanswered question. Forensics could tell her how deep they went, what size they were, even the brand of boot, but not why they were there or what that person had seen before deciding to walk away. In her final report, she quoted something Sheriff Donnelly had said years earlier. During one of the anniversary vigils, he'd been standing by the same ridge, same fog rolling in behind him. When a reporter asked if he believed the case would ever be solved, he paused for a long time before answering. "We'll find the truth," he said, "but not the whole of it." Now, more than 2 decades later, those words had never felt truer. The Red Hollow case was closed. The science made sense. The records were complete. Yet for everyone who'd stood at that ridge and looked into the trees, there would always be that feeling that something else was buried, deeper still, waiting under the quiet ground, unseen, but not entirely gone.